Hey readers, it's Andrea and welcome to my channel. How do I want to start this? Probably should have thought of that before I sat down. This is the second review I've done on my channel. I have wanted to do more reviews, but usually when I'm reading, like for a review, I'm going to take notes and maybe highlight and tab different things. And I just haven't read a book where I really feel like doing that and reviewing it. I probably should have with The Help, which is one of my current reads. But I think that I will pick up trying to do more reviews with The Book of Unknown Americans by Christina Henriquez over here. So, the book I'm going to be reviewing today is The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. We actually read this in AP English, so it made it really easy for me to take notes and stuff, because I would have to do that for the class anyways. Since we are in the times of the COVID-19, we read like a book that he had assigned to us before we had been sentenced to home, which was The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. See, I can remember things. And then we didn't really know what we were going to do next. So the 11th grade honors class, I matched my book. The 11th grade honors class had read this, so Mr. Hayes had us pick this up. So, I'm going to review this today, and if you see me looking down, and I keep looking down still, I have my English notebook that is full of notes and now things that are highlighted that I really want to point out. And I just have my booktube notebook with a few notes for what I want to say before I really get going into the book. So, the things I want to say are, it was an AP reading book, so we did go into depth with this in a class, and I will talk about what we discussed as a class versus my thoughts personally while reading this. I also wanted to point out that I rated this 5 out of 5 stars on Bookreads. Actually, all of my April reads were 5 out of 5 stars, so that's actually exciting. I haven't had a 5 out of 5 star in a while. So I usually reserve 5 out of 5 stars lately for like all-time favorite books or books in a series. That will usually differ between 4 or 5 stars depending on how much I liked it. But I really liked this. I loved the main character, who is Holden Caulfield, and I really related to him, which I think is kind of the point. So I am just going to get into my review. Let's see. So I'm just going to go through a brief plot overview. Basically, this book is about a boy who's like a teenager, whose name is Holden Caulfield, as I have already said, who is a really troubled teenager. He has been through different boarding schools and just doesn't put effort into things, basically, is the whole point. And he is really starting to get depressed and has this disdain for life. And so he decides that he is going to leave his boarding school and go back to New York City, where he lives, for a few days before going back home to his parents. So he's gonna like venture around the city by himself. So, right in chapter 2, I have something highlighted, and that is his teacher, Mr. Spencer, who is one of, I think it was his history teacher, mentions that life is just a game, and Holden doesn't seem to agree with that and saying that it's just for hotshots. And my interpretation of a hotshot, we didn't really talk about this in class that much, but really I interpreted that as like a big rich business guy who like kind of had his stuff together and knew what he was doing in life and thought that he was just the best thing that ever walked on earth. And I was thinking that Holden would think that the opposite, that life is just a game for hotshots. I feel like when people talk about life being a game, it's really those troubled people in life, the poorer people in life, anyone who's lonely, because for them life is a game to play, and usually people who have more wealth or who have more confidence don't struggle in life. So I found that interesting. Again, we didn't really talk about any of that. I didn't highlight this, but I'm seeing it, which is why I just kind of like stammered off a little bit. He is 17 while he's writing the story, because this is in a first-person perspective, and 16 in the story. But I didn't highlight this, and I'm just noticing it now, that he says people people never notice anything. I believe he said that right in the second chapter, and it is a phrase that a lot of lonely kids seem to say. Like, I wouldn't say I'm a lonely person anymore, but I used to be, like, in a really bad place, and I've grown a lot from that. And I feel like when you are in a lonely place or in a bad place in general, you don't think that people notice a lot of things, and in some aspects that's really true, and in a lot it's not. So right in the second chapter, again, just seeing all this here, I love the writing style of this book and the flow of it. I probably could have started off by saying that, but it's written really well. Like, I love the way the main character talks, and I don't really know if I've ever really talked about Stephen King on this channel. I can't remember, and I'm not going to rack my brain trying to remember, but what I like about Stephen King's writing style and what I like about this book is even in the dull moments of a book or moments that I just don't like, it's really interesting to read because that writing style is just really good and it makes you want to keep reading. So I really liked that about this book. So, yeah. I have a note here for chapter 3 that says, I feel like he's belittling himself since the only subject he was passing was English, no confidence as a reader. In chapter 3, Holden makes a joke that he is an illiterate person, and he did flunk out of his school all subjects except for English, which he still wasn't doing too good in. He's just really good at writing compositions. And I feel here he did belittle himself, and he should have more confidence as a reader and a writer, especially because he is writing this as a character. But I think throughout the novel he doesn't have a lot of confidence in general about himself, and it's interesting to go back and look at notes that you wrote about past chapters or things that you noticed that you didn't notice carrying throughout the book type of thing. I don't know how to explain it. But yeah, he doesn't have confidence as a person in general, and I feel like that may add to the relatability of his character. A lot of teenagers don't have confidence in themselves, and I think that although this is an extreme case of a troubled teenager to an extent, Holden is a relatable character for a lot of teenagers, in my opinion. I don't know if you can hear my mom, she's on like a call for work. In my opinion, I think that he's very relatable for all teenagers, and I just wanted to make note that he isn't a confident character in general, and that doesn't make him a role model, it makes him relatable is what I was trying to say. Another thing I could have mentioned that I am also seeing in my notes is that the characters in this book are easy to fall in love with. They're very human to me. Sometimes it can get a little dry, but all these characters really have big personalities and a lot of big things to say, or they're really witty or funny or compassionate or charming and like all these different things. And I find them very easy to like and read and all of that stuff. Going back to Holden's character, I think that he finds interest in the small things in people, and we had talked about this a lot in English, or I had been thinking about it a lot, and later on I'll talk more about kind of a very small disagreement that my English teacher and I got into about how I think that he just finds like small things to notice, and I'm also a person who does that. And I think if you look at Holden's character as a writer, because he is writing this, I think that he just has a lot of qualities of a writer, like noticing small things in people and all of that stuff. So I'll get more into like the disagreement my English teacher and I got into, and just different ways of how we interpreted the book. But the last thing I noticed in chapter 4 is that I wrote this huge paragraph about how Holden was really annoyed with how his friend, was that Ackley? Sorry, Stradlater, asked him to write up an English composition for him, and he just started complaining that, like, just because when people think that you just have good grammar and stuff and know where to put commas, then they ask you to write papers. And I was like, we had to write journals for each chapter, which is why my notes are broken up like this. But I just remember being like, oh, I felt that pain too, and like people always look for me for reference and for help and stuff, and I think that that's great, but it can get annoying after a while because it's not like I'm the greatest writer in the world. So I think, again, we're talking about Holden and his relatability. Another thing I didn't highlight that I'm seeing as I'm looking down is that the humor in this book, Mr. Hayes, who's my teacher, and I talk together, because we have Google Meets calls every other day besides weekends. We talked about how just the humor isn't for everybody, but it made both of us laugh out loud, so that kind of brought us together in a way. But I personally really like the humor in this book. I think it's really funny and witty and quick, which is what I like. So if you're also looking for a funny book with good characters, then this might be it. So let's continue with the review. For the most part, this part of my notes gets everything kind of goes together instead of just being broken up by chapter. Of course, my notes are still written chapter by chapter, but the way I'm going to tell you about it, it will not be. There are a couple moments where Holden gets really anxious or seems to have like some sort of anxiety or panic attack, and I just want to point out that in this early chapter, I don't even remember what the situation was surrounding it, but Holden gets super anxious, and I just made note that as someone who suffers from anxiety, I think that it's written really well. I'm not saying that he suffers from an anxiety disorder, I just mean like when he gets anxious, it is written really well. I know there are some books that I've read that it isn't written so great, or just kind of like touches on it and like leaves it, but it is touched upon in this book, and I really liked that. Also on Holden's character, there are a few moments in the book where he kind of flirts, I guess is the word to say, with like older women and talks to them and like makes comments about them, and I think personally that he thinks he's more mature than he is, and in English we talked a lot about Holden's immaturity, but I think to me when he talks to these older women and stuff, he thinks that he's more mature than other people his age, and thinks that he would relate to them more or want to talk to them more. And I know that that's the thing that a lot of teenagers do. They think that they're more mature, and so they talk to older people. And yeah, he isn't a mature person, which I will talk about later as we go through the review. So again, with the middle-aged lady, there's a part in here where Holden, he's in New York City, he has a hotel, and he goes down to this like little club area space that the hotel has and dances with some older women. And he said this line, which I will read to you because I literally wrote it down, that I really liked. It doesn't really have to do with anything, but it will also give you a taste for the writing style if you have never read this before. So I am just going to read this little highlighted piece. So it says, "That's the thing about girls. Every time they do something pretty, even if they're not too much to look at, or even if they're sort of stupid, you half fall in love with them, and then you never really know where the hell you are. Girls, Jesus Christ, they can drive you crazy, they really can." I don't know why I like that so much. I don't know, I thought it was nice. It just kind of gives you a taste for the writing style and how Holden thinks, and I just really like that line. We are reaching the middle of the novel and the point of my review, and Holden, a few times in the book, asks about the ducks in Central Park who live in a little pond, and where do they go once it's winter and the pond freezes over. And I believe this might be the second time he's mentioning it, or maybe the first time, but I had wrote that I think that he's curious and cares about the small things in life, and that is my big thing with Holden. I think that that is really his character and everything. And I did understand my English teacher's point towards the end of the novel when I was really seeing how he was seeing, but I didn't hear. And my teacher, and you might agree with this more than my point, because obviously he's more knowledgeable of literature than I am, but he was saying how it really represents Holden's innocent mindset. And little kids ask questions like that, like just things that we wouldn't even think of, like, well, what happens to the ducks, or why is the sky blue? Like things that we probably wouldn't even think of as older people or adults. And in English, we also talked about how adults take things for granted, like the ducks in the park. So I'll leave that up to you how you want to interpret that. That's how I'm interpreting Holden's character, is that he's a curious person and just enjoys small things in life, but he also does have an innocent mindset. And I think that that contributes to questions like that. So at this point in the novel, I started to notice a pattern that Holden would kind of go through, where he would talk about a lot of things that he hated, like maybe 2 things that he really, really hated, and then he would talk about 1 thing that he liked. Or he would talk about how much of a horrible person he was, but then he would contradict that by saying how good of a person he was. And I think that part of that was him just trying to cover himself, like, oh, I don't think that life is that bad, like, I don't want you to think that about me, or I don't want you to think I am that bad of a person, so here's a little thing, but I do have a grim outlook on life. And I was starting to see Holden's immaturity more, and just, like, how he is acting, and when he meets up with an old friend of his named Luce, and just how, like, the conversation was going, and you could just really see his immaturity coming out. So I think that also has to do with the pattern that I noticed. And this is the point of the book, and we're really in the last part of it, of what I'm describing here. But he starts to think about what would happen if he were to die in the park, when he's just kind of sitting there in chapter 20. And it really started to get grim from that point. Like, the humor really was starting to lift a lot. And I think Holden's true feelings on life were starting to come out. So, yes. And now I have, up until the end of the book, a ton of stuff highlighted. And I'm just going to go quickly through it. So he goes home and he visits his little sister named Phoebe. And his parents come home, and he doesn't want to know that they're there because he's trying to, like, stay away from them until he can go home on, like, Wednesday, which is when he was due to come home if he hadn't flunked, and then he has to break the news to them, so he's really avoiding them. But he goes to his old English teacher's house from one of his other boarding schools. And there are 2 quotes that his English teacher says to him. One is an actual quote from the character. The other one is a quote, and I'm an idiot and didn't write down where it's from, and I really don't feel like looking it up in the middle of this, so if you read the book, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. So, there's a line that I think about sums up the novel and how other characters interact with Holden that says, "Frankly, I don't know what the hell to say to you, Holden." And that is what his old English teacher says, and I think that just really sums it up. Like, a lot of people try to talk to Holden and tell him how grim he is, or tell him how immature he is, and all of that stuff, and Holden just kind of, like, doesn't listen, and no matter how people word it, or what people say, Holden doesn't want anything to do with it. So I think that really sums up the novel. And then this other quote is a quote that is something separate from the novel, but I wrote it down because I liked it. And it says, "The mark of an immature man is that he wants to die nobly for a cause, while the mark of the mature man is that he wants to live humbly for once." Yeah. So, his old English teacher, whose name is Mr. Antolini, I'm going to talk about him for a minute, putting the book down. So I found his character to be really interesting. Originally I had wrote down that he was my second favorite. I liked his intelligence, I liked his charm, I liked him as a character, and I liked his wisdom and all of that good stuff. And he really tries to let Holden know that he isn't alone in his feelings, and that everyone struggles through things, but he has to push through it. And honestly, there's nothing better than an English teacher who actually, like, cares about his or her students, and who's always there for them, and all that stuff. And as I'm sitting here reading Mr. Antolini's character, and just really enjoying what I'm reading, Holden goes to sleep there. He hasn't slept in a long time, so he crashes on their couch. And he wakes up to Mr. Antolini petting his head, and, like, really freaks out and thinks that it's, basically calls Mr. Antolini a pervert and jets. And I have really mixed feelings about this, so I'm going to tread a little lightly. I think that if I were to wake up to an old English teacher petting my head, I would also think that was a perverted action. But I also think Holden as a character really has a hard time separating, like, I had this written down very well, hold up. I think that he really is mistaking affection for perversion. Do I think that it's okay that his English teacher just pet his head? No, I think that that's kind of weird. But I also don't think that he was trying to be creepy, and this book is kind of old. One moment, please. Let's see. Probably could have figured this out. 46? Is that what I'm reading here? let's say 40, oh, copyright, okay, 1945, 1946, 1951. So, I mean, I don't know if it was intended to be written as creepy, like, compared to how we see things now, but when Holden runs away, Mr. Antolini kind of, like, sits in the doorway, like the archway to his apartment, and kind of watches him go, and I guess that could also be creepy. I still have really mixed feelings about that. I think that when he was talking to Mr. Antolini had some good points to tell him and everything. So I think if you read this, let me know, or if you have read this, let me know in the comments what you thought of this, because no one really talked about it in English. And I think that's weird, but I think on Tuesday we're going to talk about the end of the novel more, so maybe in the comments I can give an update. This book did make me cry. Towards the end, this isn't really a spoiler, so I will share it. There's an ant crawling across my floor. I don't want to kill him. You go that way? So you're not near me? Yeah, go that way. Excuse me. Go away. Go away, go away, go away. Go that way. Thank you. Sorry, what was I saying? Oh, it made me cry, and I'm going to share because it's not really like a spoilery point. There's a point, and this is Holden's lowest point in the novel. We're at the last like 2 chapters, where he's just kind of like walking around, and he has left Mr. Antolini's house and everything, and he's thinking that he just wants to leave. And he gets really anxious and paranoid that every single time he's going to step off the curb that he's going to disappear. And that he talks to his dead brother, Ali, who, if you decide to read this, you will read about. He died of leukemia. It's cancer of something. I want to say it was either leukemia or, like, a bone cancer. But he talks to his brother until he gets across the street and then thanks him. And I think just the way that that was written, and having been in that low of a place before, was really hard for me to read. And it really does, like, just make me cry. So basically the rest of the book is he kind of just finds, like, happiness, and he's writing to us from what seems to be, like, a psychiatric hospital. We never really hear too much about how he ends up there. He's kind of just, like, at the end of the book, he's kind of like, well, that's all I'm going to tell you, type of thing. I, again, really, really liked this. I loved... Just to recap my review, I loved the writing style, I loved Holden as a character, I loved all of the characters, I loved the storyline, I found it to be relatable, I found it to be funny, it is a very short book, and it is one of my now favorite books of all time. I do want to reread it and see if I can get more from it. But I think that the book makes some good points about innocence, and there's this really... I didn't talk about it in my review for some point, but there's this point where Holden is talking to his sister and about the poem that the title comes from for the book that is like a wrong reading of the poem. But he says that if he were in a field of rye and kids were jumping off the edge, he would try to grab them. And at first I interpreted that as try to save people from suicide, because before that he had been talking about an old school friend who had committed suicide, so suicide warning in here. But talking to my English teacher, we talked about how he was saving kids from growing up, and I think that that is actually a better interpretation and a really strong theme in the novel, that Holden is afraid of growing up and has a disdain for grown-ups and how uncreative and miserable they are, and is afraid of turning into that. And I think when you are a teenager who's reading this book, it's a scary thing to grow up, and that's a really relatable thing to read, even if you aren't flunking school and just have a horrible attitude towards life. So I'm just going to wrap this up by saying this is a banned book in some areas, and I knew that going into it. There are swear words, there are mentionings of sex, there are a whole bunch of... Ah, the ant's back! There's all that stuff, so be warned. There's also suicide in here, if that bothers you. Of course, for good reasons. I don't know why I said if that bothers you. Like, it's a stupid thing to be bothered by. It isn't. But, yeah, so all of that. I hope you enjoyed this review. I hope that it made sense, because this wasn't really too premeditated to go into. And I really, really, really recommend this. Like, I know a lot of kids in my class said that they were bored with it, or didn't like it. It's a really easy and quick read. I don't know, like, I really liked this book. And I hope that if you're watching this, I tried to keep it a little bit away from the plot, but giving enough so you knew where I was coming from. But if you were planning on reading this, then you weren't going to like get any spoilers. So yeah, thank you for watching. You can follow me on Instagram, Goodreads, Twitter, Tumblr, and Snapchat. I have the same handle for everything. It is @ReadWithAndrea. And I think that next week I will do an April wrap-up for you guys. I only read 3 books, but when you see the size of them, you'll understand. And I hope y'all have a good day.